And welcome back to another podcast with Mr. Hagan. And on this podcast, we're going to take a look at the determinants of demand for labor. Determinants of demand for labor. So what I've been talking about on some of the videos in this playlist is the supply and demand for labor. So I have labor, the quantity of labor on the horizontal axis, and I have the price of labor on the vertical axis, and I have a downward sloping demand curve for labor. And that demand curve is, we said on a previous video, is called the value of the marginal product of labor, the value of the marginal product of labor. And we said that the value of the marginal product of labor was made up of two things. It was equal to the output price, the product that we're selling in the market. Maybe the company is selling TVs or something like that. So this would be the price of the televisions multiplied by the marginal product of labor, which is, remember, the marginal product of labor, that is the change in quantity or output divided by the change in the number of workers, divided by the change in labor. So the value of the marginal product is made up of the output price times the marginal product of labor. Now, here's why that's important when we start thinking about determinants. Because remember what determinants are. Determinants are things that shift the demand curve. So the question is, what are the determinants that shift the demand curve for labor, that make companies want to buy more labor or less labor? And two of those determinants, two of them are right here. Two of them are right here. That is to say, the value of the marginal product of labor is the demand curve, and the value of the marginal product of labor is made up of the output price and the marginal product. So if the output price or the marginal product change, then that will shift the demand curve. So I'm just going to go through these demand curves, these determinants of demand very quickly. The first determinant of demand, there are three of them. The first one is output prices, and we could just say this. If the output price increases, that would be like an increase in the price of televisions. Well, if the price of televisions goes up, that's going to cause the value of the marginal product to go up, and that's going to cause the whole demand curve to shift to the right. And then the opposite would be if there's a decrease in price, then the demand for labor is going to shift left. If TV prices go down, then people are going to buy fewer TVs, which means the company is going to make fewer TVs, which means they're going to want to hire fewer workers, and then that would cause the demand curve to shift into the left. Okay? Number two, the second determinant of demand is technological change. So now, when I say technological change, I'm talking about a technology used to produce the good. A technology that labor uses. So this would be, for example, workers used to produce shirts sewing by hand. Now they produce shirts with sewing machines. So the sewing machine would be a change in technology that increases worker productivity. And that means, if it increases worker productivity, that means that it's increasing the marginal product of labor. And then here we are again. If we increase the marginal product of labor, that's going to increase the value of the marginal product, and that's going to cause the demand curve to shift out to the right. Okay, and that's maybe a little bit surprising because most people are going to think that, oh, the technology is going to replace the worker. All right. Well, in this case, we're making the argument that the technology is complementary to the worker. Okay. The worker is going to be more productive, and so you're going to want the worker more because they can run this sewing machine. That they have the skills to run the sewing machine. That then is going to make you a lot more money because you can produce a lot more shirts. Okay. Now that would not always have to be the case. That's kind of the standard argument that we're making here. But the question in today's world is whether technology is a substitute for labor. Okay, so that if we buy some sort of machine that can sew the shirt without a human being, that would substitute the human being, then that would be a different question. That increase in technology would actually shift the demand curve to the left. But we're going to ignore that for the moment. That's a big deal, but just I'm going to ignore it here as I think about this model right now. If you decrease, sticking to the standard argument, if you decrease technology, then that's going to cause the demand curve to shift to the left. Okay, so that's going to be the opposite of this one. And then that gets into another debatable issue, and that is, and I'm going to argue this, but we could debate it. For now, I'm just going to make the argument. If you lower the capital gains tax, Okay, the capital gains tax is the tax on when companies are buying capital, when they're buying things like sewing machines. If you're going to lower the capital gains tax, that will increase the amount of capital that companies are willing to purchase, and that will therefore increase technology, which will increase worker productivity. And that, now here comes the rest of my argument, that increases the marginal product of labor, which increases the value of the marginal product, which actually increases the demand for labor. So we could debate whether this is true. There's definitely in this whole technology thing, there's definitely room for argument here. So I'm giving you the standard kind of neoclassical argument, but all of this becomes debatable when we start to think about, is technology going to replace people rather than being complementary to people? So right now I'm making the argument in terms of the standard economic argument, but just understand that there are arguments against this that I'm not getting into, at least right here. And then finally, number 3 is the supply of other factors. Okay, so what do I mean by supply of other factors? Well, that would mean like if a company buys more land, or if a company buys, example that I just gave, if a company buys more sewing machines, more capital. So if it's a farm and they buy more land, then they're going to want more workers to farm that land, and that would shift the demand for workers, for labor, to the right. If they buy more sewing machines, then they need more workers to run those sewing machines. That causes demand for labor to shift to the right. And then the opposite, if you decrease the supply of other factors, so if you decrease the supply of land, then you don't need as many workers to farm the fields. Demand shifts left. If you have fewer sewing machines, then you don't need as many workers. Demand shifts to the left. Okay, so those are my rules for my determinants of demand. So those are the determinants of demand. All right, so on some future videos, then I've talked about now the demand curve and the determinants of demand. On some future videos, we need to talk about the supply of labor and the determinants of supply, and then we need to put this all together onto a supply and demand graph. All right, but we'll do that on some future videos. Thanks for joining me. This has been Mr. Hagan, and we'll see you on the next Econ podcast.